Welcome to session 2D, Staying Ahead and Navigating an Evolving Cyber Threat Landscape. I'm sure you all heard a lot from Adam this morning and looking forward to hearing some perspectives of two people who are actually working in that field as opposed to just telling us a bit about what's out there, what's coming at us. So my name's Sue Ironside. I'm a Vice President of IIA-Australia, and it's my pleasure to facilitate this session today. Our speakers today, Mick Dunne, Chief Security Advisor at Microsoft, and Simon Steere, Chief Security Officer at Visy. Now, normally with these, I would read out the bio, but we've decided to change things up today, and I'm going to ask Mick to kick us off and tell us a little bit about your background, your role. What are the key risks that are on your radar that you're dealing with right now that you'd like people to be aware of?
Yes, my name's Mick Dunne. I'm a recovering Chief Information Security Officer, so I've had that role in the past in a financial services institution. Now working for Microsoft in a advisory type role. So I've got a team across Asia. We go out and deal with the C-suite, but primarily Chief Information Security Officers day to day, helping them think about their strategy and supporting their relationship back into Microsoft. A lot of what we do is actually bringing prior work experience to bear. Sometimes it's offering introductions out to industry, things like that. Prior to the Microsoft role, as I said, financial services, I worked in telco, I did large consulting, small consulting. I worked in the federal government in cybersecurity, and I had 22 years in the military. So fairly diverse sort of background. And when a certain person in the room here offered me a chance to come and talk to a room full of auditors without being subject to an audit, I thought this is fantastic. So I'll give you an opinion. I think what I'm hearing when I'm out engaging with, Chief Information Security Officers and Microsoft's a big part of this. We're pushing AI like there's no tomorrow. Microsoft's bet the farm on that. We're getting a lot of take up with our customers, but the realities are that the security piece is quite challenging. The conversation, who's the buyer for AI? It's not the security team normally, although there's two sides to that AI coin. There's security for AI, and then there's AI for security. So thinking about that though, it's a CIO, it's, boards, executive are driving change into their business and they want to adopt AI, and quite often the security team's the last one to know, and it throws up some challenges. And so often the concerns that we're getting around, well, how do we secure AI in our organisation? How do we get that right? And we can talk some more about that, but some of the foundational things that when I'm out speaking, I talk about the sins of the past, the work that we haven't got done. And a lot of that work still relates to identity and data security and identity and data governance, by the way. And, if we had those foundational things in a good state, that's going to enable us to adopt AI in a more effective way. But I'll stop there and save some more for later.
Thanks, Mick.
Good afternoon, Simon Steere is my name, the Chief Security Officer at Visy. Visy's a privately owned company, 75 years old, specialising in manufacturing, recycling, resource recovery and logistics. So very big company. You don't realise how big it is until you actually get hired by a company like Visy. So we have 160 sites globally, and I look after as a CSO, so slightly different to a CISO. I do the role of a CISO, but I also do the other side as well, so physical and personnel security, I do privacy, crisis management. So you'll see more and more of that within the industry, whether it's through title or whether it's just through job osmosis. I think you'll find a lot of security leaders will end up leading the broader suite of security. So my background, so I actually started, I've come to, I guess we'll call it cyber in a non-conventional way. So I came from originally as a detective, so Victoria Police for 12 years, went to Crown Casino in Melbourne and was 7.5 years there as their head of security, and went to the National Broadband Network and helped build their cyber program, and then came across to Visy as a Chief Security Officer. So 30 odd years in security risk, one way, shape or form. So what am I seeing and what are the challenges we deal with? Look, the complexity of the threat. There is an industry that's built on fear, uncertainty and doubt and catastrophising what's going on. I know there's been a lot of talks today about cybersecurity, and it's long been the new black. I think AI is certainly the new black. So it's my job to look at how do I protect an organisation that has a big manufacturing footprint as well. So not only just a corporate environment, but we have 160 sites, so 120 plus manufacturing. How do I protect that when you've got aging, equipment on one side of a fence? We have a glass making facility that's decades old, several decades old, with old legacy technology. And on the other side of that, we have a warehouse that has autonomous vehicles. So as you would see in an Amazon environment, we have autonomous forklifts moving around. How do I protect those state-of-the-art equipment? So I think from a risk and threat perspective, it's ever increasing, ever challenging in our roles, but it is a great job. I think ransomware as a service, phishing as a service has long been commoditised, but AI is making that more difficult for us as practitioners to defend an organisation against. And I think a really good example of that is deepfakes, and that was a couple of years ago, it was just spoken about, it'll be an issue. Now there's a number of issues that have happened, and there was an incident in Hong Kong about a year ago where an organisation was defrauded from $25 million from a deepfake. So, that's a senior exec turning up to a meeting with another senior exec thinking that's the person that they're talking to and initiating a financial transaction that wasn't legitimate. So we've got to defend all that, and then in that is, how do the execs know enough is enough? How do the execs know that we're investing in the right areas? So I think as security leads, our job is to be that interpreter. So how do we understand that fear, uncertainty and doubt, align with the right maturity model, develop the right strategy and plan to give them comfort that we are investing in the right areas?
Thank you. So look, given we're talking to internal auditors, I'm going to turn the question a little bit around. In your experience, what are the key risks and controls that you would expect internal auditors to be focusing on in your areas?
I think for most organisations, there's an alignment to a framework, which is always a good starting point. So, in my last organisation, we're aligned to NIST. I'm dealing with organisations who are, focused on Essential 8, etc. So, looking at, what are those foundational controls? I think, Simon's point, just picking on the fear, uncertainty and doubt. Cybersecurity and, the software community, which now I'm part of, trades so heavily on that. And there is some sophisticated attacks out there, but most organisations that get done over are getting done over on the fundamentals and the basics. So, security teams, organisations, it's fed by the media, are very, very excited about the next shiny thing, but they haven't solved a lot of those fundamentals. So I'd be looking at the fundamentals of the program. What is the resourcing? How are you aligning against those NIST models of, identify, protect, detect, respond and recover? I think one of the challenges with cyber is that we assume it's this narrow profession, but you guys are going into organisations and realising that it's such a broad set of skills and capabilities to operate a cybersecurity function effectively. So, to rattle off a list of controls is, quite challenging. But I'll give the example I had when I was working in Australian Super. We had obligations under CPS 234. One of the requirements of that regulation is to ensure that your security program is part of your regular audit program. The internal interpretation was that that was an annual 234 audit. And really what that meant was that it was an inch deep and a mile wide. And it was frustrating because I wasn't getting any depth into my program. So, a step I took there was to go and work with, firstly, my internal audit team and then our co-source partner to think about how do we look at this in a more systemic way? Can we shift to maybe a 3-year program but deep dive into the requirements, each year? So we can actually get some, root cause analysis type things, really begin to dig into what is going wrong with the program or where we can find improvements. Because, these surface level audits, it's time consuming, they don't offer a lot, and you're not meaningfully improving a security program. So, for me to be able to have that partnership with my auditor and, and my internal audit leads to do that was quite the game changer, where we could really start to go deep and see if we can make some improvements into the program.
Mick's covered 2 that I was going to cover. So, but I agree with the maturity and the foundation, because I think that's you've got to do the basics right, and a lot of security leaders or security teams will want to buy the next shiny tool, but how do you actually do the foundation right? I think for me, there's a couple of others as well. Governance and culture. So the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0 added governance. So the importance of that and setting up the right culture is it's just vital. It's cyber is just another business risk. So it doesn't sit with me. It sits the exec level. It's one of our 10. But how do I give the exec an understanding of what that means? So I think from a governance perspective, you've got to have that tone from the top. If I stand there and say it's important in a company by myself without a team, not much would happen. So I can have an effective team and not much will happen if we don't have the executive support and then the oversight of that program of work. So it's been critically important for me. So my interview process with Visi, I was interviewed by 4 or 5 members of the exec, including the CEO, and that was a key question for me. What support will you provide? Because I knew roughly where they were, I knew what I needed to do because I knew the previous CISO, so I had a pretty good insight. But my question then was, what will you support? What's your governance model? What's the culture like in relation to security? And all the execs gave great answers, but I then was offered the job. I actually asked for one more meeting because I wanted to back over that because it was just going to be critically important for me. I know too many CSOs or CISOs that get jobs that ends up just being them, and they're either a CISO that comes out in the event of a breach and they've got to deal with it, or they're overseeing a program of work that is just not realistic. So I think if you're going to align to a maturity model, you've got to have that governance and culture that sits over the top. And then I think the other one is asset management. So you've got to understand what your critical assets are. And that sounds like a simple and obvious statement, but if you walk into a complex organisation that doesn't have a great maturity, it takes a while to figure that out. And as CISOs or CSOs, I mean, you see breaches every other day, right? It seems like it. They're going to happen. But what are your critical data sets? What are your critical physical assets, critical people that if there is a breach, that's going to cause you the biggest problem, because if you can't protect everything with a limited investment bucket, how do you protect what really matters most? And then how do you then understand what may be breached that certainly may be inconvenient, may not be great, but it wouldn't be life-changing for the company? Then how do you articulate that to the executive? How do you understand what that is and put the right controls potentially around it? So it sounds a lot simpler, but it certainly takes most CSOs or CISOs a long time to find out what are the critical data sets, and there'll be something that you never thought you had. So, and a breach is often in an environment, might be a developed environment or a test environment that you didn't even know existed. So that's for me.
In one of the earlier sessions today around AI, there was a question around how much skill and knowledge do internal auditors need around AI? And just thinking about it in your space, what sort of skills would you expect to see on an internal audit team coming to do an audit in your area?
I think, well, again, back to my earlier comment, it's such a broad domain, but if we're thinking about AI specifically, take the time to learn and understand how it works. I've got a colleague who does fantastic presentations around AI. I'm not that person, unfortunately, but, in security, we're normally talking about things that are quite deterministic. Something, A happens, and you can know that B will happen, and that's going to happen every single time. Whereas AI becomes non-deterministic because it's going to give different outputs. Have you ever, asked an AI agent a question and then asked the same question and gone, oh, hang on, I've got a different answer this time? So, that non-deterministic nature of AI is going to throw up some challenges, and we're going to learn some things as we go along. But understand AI, understand how it works, understand around, the language models, understand where those risks are. More and more publications are coming out around, what are the risk domains for AI? Thinking about things like, the AI prompt injection. Historically, we've had, prompt injection's always been a security problem. We used to have SQL database prompt injection that caused issues. So some of the issues that we're seeing aren't new conceptually, but they're being applied to AI, and this is the thing we need to think about. Once we go from basic AI that a lot of organisations are at, I won't say Copilot, although I just did, but whether it's a Gemini or whatever, it's a human and an agent working together. And then as we progress, we're going to see humans working with agents, and the agents are going to become part of that workforce, and then ultimately going to get to a third stage where the agents are just working on their own and they're doing it. So if you haven't got the foundational security in place while we're at this early days, what is going to happen later on? You're going to have security issues, you're going to have to go back and do rework. So my encouragement to any organisation right now would be you should be working on those foundations today, because if you want to enable your organisation to go at speed, you've got to get it right now. You can't say we're going off to agentic and we're going to make, have agent-to-agent operations and that's all going to go swimmingly, because it won't. So foundations, really boring.
There's a couple of things for me. So I think you've all got a very difficult job, to be frank. You're trying to figure out what AI is and how you audit it and how you audit us and how you work with us. at the same time, most of the industry is trying to figure it out as well, right? And it's moving at a speed that I don't think any of us have seen in any other technology. There was cloud computing, there's a whole range of technology that's come over time, but the speed at which this is coming and going from AI to agentic AI to... So a lot of us are trying to figure it out at the same time. I think there's two different skill sets. So one is the technical. You've got to either have the technical, you don't have to have it specifically individually if you have a team, but you've got to know when to outsource it or when to get some guidance and advice. So I think I wouldn't expect an auditor to come in and be able to explain it back to front, but I would expect an auditor to come in with some foundational knowledge and either some leverage support or some aid from outside. If I take it away from AI though, I think the number one critical skill that I think every auditor should have is that negotiation skills and the communication skills that can work with me. No one will know the security of the business better than the CISO or CSO, which should certainly be the case. But certainly when I came to Visi, the first person I met after the exec was the head of internal audit. And together we built programs and we've developed calendars of what they're going to spend their money on, because as a CISO, I've got a limited amount of time to actually respond to audits. Auditors have got a limited amount of time to do audits, and we can't just get into a loop of doing audits. So I think there's the two, there's the soft and the technical. But I have had a lot of audits in my time where you come up and you know that the audit doesn't have the knowledge, and this is outsourced help. And you end up spending a lot of time in a loop about that. Control doesn't really matter. I mean, it's important, but in the scheme of things, you've missed a gaping hole over here. So to Mick's point, are we doing the foundations right before we think about anything advanced? Because AI is going to either enhance bad controls, or if you've got good controls, it'll show that as well. So if you're already miles behind, AI will show that up. If you're going okay, AI will be good for you. So the last thing you want to do is go full steam ahead on AI if the organisation doesn't have the right controls in place at a baseline.
You talked a little bit, Simon, about governance, tone at the top, and the speed of change that's happening now. What is your thoughts about the board and the head of internal audit and the internal audit team actually staying abreast, similar to how you need to? And what is the role of the CISO or CSO in helping with that education?
Firstly, as again, cyber is just another business risk, and it should be security, not cyber, by the way, because the first way one of my manufacturing plants can get breached is physically. Someone can walk in there and do something. So you've actually got to look at the physical control. So I won't get on too much of a soapbox about that, but it's just another business risk. So how do we make sure it's in a language that the execs understands? Now, there's two schools of thought really for this. At the board and exec level, I've done IIA-Australia. A lot of people here would have done it as well and got tertiary degrees, but there's a lot of people saying, well, boards should have more cyber experts on there. Now that's great, but it's probably not realistic. One, there's not enough of us to go around. I would like to see that eventually, and I think that will happen. And I'll get to the second point in a sec, but boards are managing a number of risks. I'm just one of them. So if they've got the right team in place, I do think they need to be cyber literate, and there's a number of different resources. AICD have resources, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre have a great, it's not top 10, but at the top questions boards should ask. So if you haven't seen that, I'd recommend you look that up, because it says, what are the top things as a board or exec member I should know? And it's a lot of the stuff we're talking about, the basics. So they've got to be cyber literate, I think, to be able to answer the questions, and then to know when to get external help in to say, we need an independent review or we need an independent view. I have a different view at the exec level. I think they need to be cyber literate as well, but I think you're seeing more CSOs or CISOs getting senior roles. So we used to be buried 3, 4, 5 deep within an organisation. I report to a member of the exec who reports to the CEO, and that was important for me in getting my role, because that comes to that governance and culture. Am I going to get FaceTime with the exec? Not because I want exposure, but because I want the exec to understand, one, what the challenges are, what the risk is, that's where the money is, that's where the investment comes from, how do I give them comfort? So I think all members of the exec need to be cyber literate. But I do think you'll see over time, there's at least a couple of high profile cases in Australia now where you've got execs that are managing security and risk at top companies. And I think you'll see more of that, because we've got to prove we've got the commercial acumen, but a lot of the leaders I know could sit at that level. We've got HR there, we've often got heads of facilities there, we've got heads of legal there, so why couldn't a senior security leader sit on that executive? And then ultimately that flows through eventually to boards. What's my role? It's critically important. So I've got to help them learn. You've got to identify first who understands technically, who doesn't, because they're sitting there and last thing you want is the exec not asking a question because they feel like they don't understand it. And this is an industry that plays on this. It's the worst part of our industry. They will, if you go to any cyber conference, it's red neon lights, it's the world's going to end, this is the worst of anything, Armageddon's coming, AI, it's the same story, right? You hear the worst of it more than you hear the best. So my role is to educate the execs. What are they worried about? Where's the business going and how do I enable that? But what are they worried about? How do I educate them? How do I tell them about the ASD top 10 or the ASD Q&A? So how do I educate them over time so they become more confident to ask me questions? And also, that's a two-way street. How do I make sure that I tell them everything they need to know, good and bad? So they've got to understand what all the risks are, what the opportunities are. But I think good leaders will work with their executive to make sure they feel more confident and over time build their knowledge.
And probably just to add to that, so I've been involved in board education pieces for a number of boards to help them uplift their skill and understanding. Simon and I were just chatting before even, if you've got cyber insurance, bring your insurers into the table, get them to present to your board and help them understand the roles and responsibilities that they have. Just touching on that other point, the governance piece and supporting what Simon said, cyber is just a trigger event for a business impact. And the business impact is going to be probably a loss of data, a loss of availability, and ultimately, maybe some sort of regulatory type issues. So that really dumbs cyber down, but it's not really the way that we talk about it. We do like to make it really complex and special. And look, hopefully no one from APRA's in the room. Even APRA CPG 234 has a whole list of things that you take to the board, and 99% of those things are just going to be of no interest to the board. So getting the right level of conversation with the board to get them to challenge you. Their role is governance and risk oversight, helping an organisation with strategy. So, we've got to find that balance in, messaging and giving them the ability to ask the right questions about where we're at with our strategy. And sometimes that biggest piece, and, my biggest success with the board was really getting them to understand we are investing, we are putting controls in place, we've got a program, we are not where we want to be today, and we probably never will be, by the way. But with that ongoing investment and oversight, we're going to be in a position to hopefully stop a lot of the basic type attacks, but we're also in a position to respond really, really well, and we can do the recovery piece, which is what they're going to care about. And then they begin to understand that it's not a problem that we're going to solve. It's not. Have you fixed that yet, Mick? As a chief operating officer once asked me, when have you fixed this, Mick? It's always going to be this ongoing thing, and that requires an ongoing dialogue with the board.
And I think just expanding on that a little bit, if you do this right, security should be an enabler. So it should be a competitive advantage, and that was one of the pictures of me getting a job, and it's where I've worked before. The same leaders have had the same philosophy. So if we do all this right, it should be a competitive advantage. Now I'm actually now in pitches to get business within my company, and they are asking about security. So this is coming. So this is becoming more common. So if we actually do good security, there's an ROI. So rather than just saying it's a cost center, the sky is falling, you put the right governance and framework in and culture, you actually then can say there's an ROI. So we can't just keep going up and scaring boards and execs, because it is never done. But we've got to be able to show, did we buy down some risk? They're investing a lot of money. There's a lot of figures that, if you go through how much different companies are spending on cyber, it's never done, and that can be frustrating for an exec, right? Because I'm putting a lot of money in this in a difficult environment, but how do we say, it's never done, but here's where we are, here's to Mick's point, here's where we're going, and that's appropriate for us. And that is different for everyone, and there's certainly been some action taken. Regulators have gone from education, awareness to compliance and prosecution now in the last 2 years, that's clear. And a couple of those prosecutions have been, what you had wasn't good enough for the data you were holding. So that's going to be different. It's going to be different for my company. It's going to be different for the previous company I was at and the next company I may work at. So you've got to get that model right, and that's difficult for execs to manage.
Thank you both. I think it's time for me to hand over to the audience. I'm sure you've got questions. We're going to have a roving mic, so if you want to just pop your hand up.
I was just going to throw one last thing out before I hand over the microphone to. There's an assumption, I think, that it's the security team that does security. And in most organisations, that's not actually the case. You know, sometimes securities governance and oversight, they'll certainly be running some operational capabilities like security operations. But you think about your modern work team, your cloud engineering team, there's all these other technology teams that play a role, your internal risk function, etc. So the whole organisation needs to be working on the security problem, otherwise you're not going to be successful. So maybe question number one might be who's working on security, and if they point to the security team, you've probably got a problem.
To me, the role of a traditional security person in terms of physical security controls is wildly different to technical cyber, I suppose, background. How then, I guess, in rolling up all cyber and physical security under one, how does that work? Like, to me, it's, you know, like in my particular organisation, Insider Threat was birthed out of a traditional security team, and they're trying their best to pull every other department, including cyber, into the fold. But yeah, I'm just sort of thinking they're very, the practical application of risk management. I can see how that would come from a security background, but not too sure with the technical part.
Yeah, it's a good question, and firstly, it's not for everyone. And I sit in two communities from a peer perspective. So I sit in a physical security community, and chat groups and conferences, and I sit in the cyber community. And there's a crossover of a smaller percentage of people that sit in both. And I think, and I don't advocate it's for everyone or every company, because I don't think it is. But I think if you've got the skill set, it can be done. So it's security risk. So whether it's a bad guy doing something, trying to break into a factory, whether it's a threat actor trying to, a ransomware as a service or a phishing and stuff, it is a bad person trying to do something. So principally it's the same. Now you've got to be able to understand the technical of that. And I've built that up over sort of 14, 15 years. I was probably in a unique opportunity way back when to get an opportunity to do this before cyber was as complex as it is now. So I did have the chance to do that, educate, get a master's and build some teams. But it is not for everyone, but it is security risk. So when I was a detective way back when, and I would go to a burglar as a young uniformed policeman, and there was a house and they got broken into, and you go next door and they said, what do we need to do? I said, you need to make your house better than the house next door and the better house next door, because crooks are opportunistic and they will just go where it's easy. And cyber and physical is the same thing. Take nation state out of it, and we could speak about that, but most of it is volume crime. So how do I make my company better than anyone else? Because then they'll just keep knocking on other doors. So it's not for everyone, but it's certainly doable because it is security risk. It's about risk controls.
And to add to that, and I've also had accountability for physical security. Physical security is building access systems, it's video camera systems, it's tools and technology. So, and there's also value in that, in bringing those things together. So from a security operations type perspective, to see that Mick Dunne badged in to this particular building, he's then accessed this particular technology system, that's giving you a more complete view of what's happening. So, the teams can operate in isolation, but there's a big overlap in terms of the collaboration required to investigate an incident properly, because there's going to be elements of, physical, people and technology in any incident.
And I think, just to extend on that one quick more while we get the next question up, I mean, it's also helpful if you can do it for the exec, right? Because they've got one person, one point of accountability. So one pro. I won't say one pro, but yeah, they've got one person they can ring up. So yesterday and the weekend, I'm dealing with getting personnel out of countries that are impacted by what's happening in the Middle East, right? So that's not cyber, that's a physical personnel security. Are they safe? And on Friday, I'm dealing with penetration testing results. So if I can talk to the CEO, the CEO can pick up the phone and ring one person, it makes their job easier. But it is not for everyone, but I think more and more people do it. Is it easier for the cyber side to pick up the physical side? Some would argue because the technical side is somewhat more challenging, some would argue, but I've seen a lot of really effective protective security leaders jump the other way as well.
Hello. A bit of a left field question, particularly on the evolving threat landscape. What are your thoughts on quantum computing, the advancement, the speed in which it's been developed, and the threats that it poses to organisations that are different to what exists at the moment?
Yeah, it's certainly advancing, and this is where, for those who don't know about the ACSC, Australian Signals Directorate. They've got some great material on this about what organisations should be doing right now. It is certainly something that is on every effective CISO's radar. So we are looking at that right now. What does that mean for us in the next 5 years? Because kind of the compression time of when it would be an issue is coming quicker than what they originally planned. So I think it's a significant issue that we're all going through, and one probably from a vendor perspective would be interesting to get Mick's perspective, but it's a significant piece of work. So if your company is not looking at this and you're not looking at when we should start doing an audit, but are we doing enough? I would encourage you to speak to your CISO and is it on your radar? Are we doing enough? Because if our head intelligence agency is saying you better be doing this quicker than what we originally thought a few years ago, I'd be listening.
Yeah, and similar, so Microsoft produces an annual digital defence report. One of the recommendations in that report is start preparing for quantum, because it is coming. There's already, I suppose, launching quantum safe cryptography and things that are becoming available. It should be on any organisation's plan, from a technology roadmap type perspective. What are the things that aren't going to be fit for purpose in a few years' time? There's no point having quantum sort of, then breaking out into the wild, so to speak, and then you're going to start your program to upgrade your crypto and your keys and things. It's not going to work. So it should just be thought of up front. Lots more and more stuff being published. I think NIST has put something out of late. So it's certainly a space to be on top of.
Cool. Yeah, so I got a couple of questions. So we, internal audit, we did a review of the applications that we have in our organization. And there's a couple of thousand people in the organization. We discovered that we have more applications than the number of employees in the organizations, right? And then you're right when you mentioned, so who's supposed to take care of the security side of things from IT perspective? Then that's the IT guys, right? So not the stakeholders. I think that's a common problem. So I guess there's two aspects. So number one, what kind of strategies that you put in place to ensure that everyone's aware, everyone's in the organization is aware that it's everyone's responsibility to ensure that they have enough risk assessment or privacy assessment to make sure that whatever application that they have enough control in it. And number two, how, at the practical level, how do you work with the internal auditors in terms of ensuring that all the key risks related to cybersecurity or IT, they are covered? Because in most organizations that I'm aware of, sometimes the requirement or the scope of audit in the strategic internal audit plan decided at the leadership level, so top down. So that means how do you usually kind of influence the leadership to ensure that these are top 3 issues that we have, and we should cover that in the with the internal audit team, because we usually have very limited resources and time and budget. Thanks.
It's a common challenge, and so Microsoft's had its own issues. If you remember back in 2023, there was a state-based attack that Microsoft experienced that impacted US government agencies. That led to a government review in the US. There was another state-based attack that impacted Microsoft, and it's really driven a change. So there's a program that Microsoft's calling Secure Future Initiative. There's some great learnings in that program because Microsoft has had the same issues that you just touched on. We had, over 1 million identities that were, no longer up to date or current. We had nearly 1 million applications that didn't meet our security standards. So building out the controls to make sure that those things don't begin to happen again. From an audit perspective, it's really, really challenging. But that's, if I think about, I'll say identity, because it's every audit I ever had, I'd get identity findings, and they were often, it was a user access review hadn't occurred. But what it didn't tell me was what's the shortfalls in our onboarding processes, our delegation frameworks, how do we control, identity? And that's the same, when we talk about applications and things. So sometimes, auditors will find, I suppose, what the obvious things are, but digging into that root cause, those systemic things, and trying to drill into what's actually going to make meaningful change from a security perspective is going to be really, really important. Not easy to do, but I think this is that partnership and collaboration that really needs to occur between a security function, an internal audit function, a co-sourced audit function, to try and build a meaningful audit program. And Simon's touched on what he's done at Visi, but It's not easy, and you can't fix it all quickly. So trying to surface what are those higher risk things that need to be addressed up front to try and drive value.
I think they're both great questions. The first one on the apps, I think this is if you spin it the other way, and we've had this conversation, similar problem where I am, a similar problem everywhere I've been, is if you present that to the exec, we have too many apps, or present that to the IT team, there's a friction here in the IT team, right? Because they just want to enable customer service. Help desk wants to, one, you've got to take the ability for people to do that away eventually with the right comms, but how many sharing apps have you got? You know, it's actually an ROI, and investment discussion. If you flip it to the other side and say, look, exec, we're going to spend a bit of time looking at this because it's complex, because you shouldn't have that many, but I get it, most companies do. You flip it the other side, and we're going to actually do some analysis here. And not only we actually got increased risk because we've got all these platforms, but we've got 7 of everything. So you actually need to have a standard build that says, this is your team sharing app, this is your how you're going to share documents, this is how you're going to do certain things. And that's it, that's approved. And most organisations these days are accepting that friction. You know, there's very few organisations you can come in and do anything you want. So I think that's got to be critical. How do you bring that back? But that's where my job's really hard, because to Mick's point, I'm not managing security across the company. The biggest part of my job is influence. How do I influence my peer in IT to say, we've got to get rid of these apps? Like, we've got to stop using that one, because that one, when I first came in, I saw it was here, that's been breached everywhere. So we've got to get that out of the business. So how do you start to help them help us? So how do you deputise everyone and tell them and that comes back to the culture, right? Which I'll touch on in your second question. Is you've got to, one, take the ability away for people to do it, if you can, and that's not easy. You've got to have, you know, approved apps to do certain things, and then an exemption process, because there's always going to be someone, and I work in manufacturing, there is some really bespoke applications that my manufacturing teams need, otherwise they won't be able to do X at 3 o'clock in the morning. And if I stop that, we lose millions. So I can't be that guy, right? So I've got to be, how do I give you the comfort that you have that exemption, but at least I can reduce and I can see what the risk is. On the risk, I think the question was about if the execs are kind of setting it, how do you do that? They shouldn't be. If that goes to governance and culture, right? So if an exec level is setting a cyber risk or security-related risk without the size of the CSO, I'd question whether you've got the right governance and culture. Because we've just gone through that exercise in the last couple of years, and we were heavily involved, and it was actually bottom up. It was, what are the kind of 10 risks I care about, and then how many those go up, and obviously we've got an enterprise-wide security risk, and all my feed into it. And I report on those, and that's the maturity that we didn't have several years ago. So, you know, if I went up and they said, well, this is your risk now, manager, I'm not there, because that just makes my job impossible, because then, but what about these 10 risks I really care about, which actually roll up into the enterprise risks, of which you'll have 10, 15, some will have 20, some will have less. But, you know, I've probably got a dozen that I really care about from security, including insider threat. But at the ultimate executive level, they just want to care about one, which mine roll up into. So I think you've got to have the CISO, CSO, or at least their boss in the room who understands it, and he or she can have that conversation.
Hello. If you were sitting on a board or an audit committee today, knowing what you know in your role and experience, what would be your first 2 to 3 questions in your first meeting?
So I did the IIA-Australia course a few years ago, and the first thing they said the first 5 minutes was, our aim after this course is to have you not want to sit on a board or an audit committee. So there is actually, for those who don't, there are some standard questions. So the Australian Cybersecurity Centre has these questions. They actually have a list of, it's about 10. If you ask nothing else, ask these questions. So, you know, it's got to be around, do we have a lead? Do you have a single person accountable? That's going to be obvious if you're sitting on the board, right? Do you have me or another person sitting in my role who you have a single person accountable, or 2 if you're doing cyber and physical differently? But have you aligned to a framework? Where are we? Where are we going? Is that appropriate? What's our data sets? There's some operational ones around, like, do we have logging and monitoring? Do we have a data breach response plan? They're all that sit in that question, but do we understand our legacy environment? Are we doing something about it? But at the very basics, you need to know you've got a leader, you know where you are, and you're comfortable with that, and you've either comfortable with my view, or you've had it independently assessed through audit or through an external pen test. You're going somewhere, and you're improving. You've got the right investment, and you've got the right governance and culture sits over the top, and that's appropriate for your organisation. And we will all be different. There'll be some similarities, but we'll all be different.
You had an old boss that used to sort of talk about that board question from the perspective of, you know, where are we at? What are we doing to make it better? And are we going fast enough? It's probably paraphrasing there a bit, but I think, that board question is really challenging to understand, just the maturity of your organisation, the capability. I think about probably three technical things that, you touched on one before. Do we have a strong sense of what our assets are? What's our data governance look like? Cyber talks about data security. Some unfortunate cyber leaders own data governance as well. But and then identity, they're foundational, and particularly as we're charging into this age of AI, if we don't know what our assets are, we don't know what our data is and where it is and what its value is, and we haven't got identity sorted about who can access it, then we're in real trouble. They're fairly high-level questions. The answers are a bit more complex.
We have time for one more question.
Thanks, gentlemen. That's been really insightful. Coming back to influence, Simon, you mentioned earlier. Now, you're talking to a group of internal audit people, and obviously in your world as well, influencing outcomes. In both your experiences, talk us through the characteristics around how do you develop those influencing skills? We all work in different environments, different situations, but just going to get your insight around that. So a little bit about that, war on talent. How does that all come together to get the right outcomes for an organisation?
I think firstly, you've got to understand the company you're working for, right? You've got to understand what's Visi there for? What's our purpose? How do we make money? What do the execs care about? And then how do I make Visi more successful? Sure, it's about making it more secure, but I could make Visi the most secure company tomorrow. We will never make another anything, and we'll go down the gurgler, right? So how do I understand that? And if you show that, I've found, if you show that insight to go CEO, head of operations, CFO, head of legal, what are you worried about? How do I help you? Because I've seen a lot of CISOs or CSOs or technical leads go, did you see this in the week? And this is the worst thing, we've got to do this. You don't. You don't have to do that for everything. Like if everything's important, nothing's important. So you've got to have good people skills, and everyone in this room is internal auditors. It's got to be your core foundational skill, right? How do you influence? Because you are coming, like security, not a lot of people are super happy to see me if I go into a meeting, right? Because they're going to look at, are they going to put the brakes on? Or we've got to flip that. How do we enable the business? How do I allow, when I got the job, went through the process, I said, if we do this right, and you're going to need to invest a lot, you should win more deals. You should be able to have more successful customers, because ultimately I want to go out to your customers and help them lift their hygiene. Some need it, some don't. But how do you actually show you've got a commercial mindset, not just a no person? We should be giving the business to run the confidence to run faster, not slow it down. So there'll become with some checks and balances in that, but how do we give them the guardrails to run absolutely faster and actually say, okay, this is good. We're seeing that you get it. You're seeing that we've got competing interests. You're seeing at the executive level, you're one of 10 risks. And we've got to spend all our time on all of them, right? And I've got a finite amount of money. And I go, yeah, I get that. And here's the opportunity to not do that. And risk is, obviously, there's good risk and bad risk, right? Here's some good opportunity risk. So I think if you've got that mindset and you've got the ability, your roles are critically important to ours. Like you would be my probably top 2 or 3 people in a company I need to know. You can make my job really easy and enable the company and we work together, or we can, or it will be really difficult. And a lot of people don't want to do my job, sadly. A lot of people don't want to be CISOs or CSOs because of the perceived stress. And it's a brilliant job. And if you're working with your head of internal audit and you're both good influencers, you're telling the same message to the exec. You're completely independent, right? And always should be, but we're selling the same. What do we need to tell the exec here? And we did that. We had some gaps in our OT environment. Met with the head of OT and said, how do we influence the exec here? How do we know what we want to say, but how do we do the timing and spend money appropriately? So I think that's key for me.
Yeah, and I think you covered it really. I think the battery on us, won't it? I'll just be ex-military and loud. I think that relationship piece is absolutely key. So know your business, know who the key people in the business are. As Simon said, every enterprise is going to have maybe 10 enterprise risks. Cybersecurity, might be a standalone risk, but it's going to impact a lot of those other risks. So who are those other risk owners? Who's going to care if a manufacturing goes down? Who's going to care? If there's a major data breach or, a third party can't provide the services that enable your organisation. And then it becomes more of a partnership and a collaboration about how you help the organisation be successful, because not many organisations are selling security. We are a back office function, but we need to be there to collaborate, support and enable the business. And you can't do it if you don't know the business, and you can't be effective if you don't know who your stakeholders are and have a relationship with them. So, you know, as Simon said, no one wants to see us. It's worse when it's us in HR. But, you know, you've got to be able to pick up the phone to someone in the business to get the help that you need when you really need it. And it can't be every Monday after a headline over the weekend, as you touched on. But it's relationships. It's so much of what we do. But I still run into security organisations that say, oh, well, I don't trust the business, I'll do that. It's security does that. And, you know, I think that's wrong. You've got to enable, you've got to empower the business, you've got to advise and support them, but you've also got to hold them accountable. And, you know, you've got to hold them accountable at the right time. It can't be a combative relationship, but I've seen so many security teams that either have no relationship with the business or a combative business. And if you've walked in as an auditor and you're seeing that, then you know you've got a security problem.
Well, thank you both. Really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and insights. But before we wrap up, I'm going to ask you for one last thought from each of you. What is a key takeaway that we should be thinking about as we leave this room and take back into our organisation at the end of the conference?
I think for me, don't underestimate the importance of your role to us. We are a partner. As I said, if you're in my organisation working with me and we partner together, we're telling the same story. So please you're actually an extension of what we do. And we're an extension of what you do with the right independence that sits in the middle. So we're both doing our jobs. We should be making the business more secure, more safe, more comfortable, and getting the execs the absolute comfort to go, we're investing in the right. And we're never going to get this right. We're okay in the uncertainty. We're okay in the grey, but we think we've got the right team working together. So I think your roles are 100% critical. You have a very difficult role, and so do we, but to working together, I think you can make a massive difference to any organisation.
Yeah, probably reiterating that collaboration piece, probably the hardest part of an audit, I imagine, is at the end when you're working through findings and thinking about, you know, what does remediation look like? How do we get that wording right? And the arguments that happen at that point of an audit. I would say probably embrace that argument, because really it's, you know, trying to get a better outcome, have that discussion, really be clear. I can remember in a role where sometimes the criticism was that because of the audit finding, the audit commitment was in the next 3 months we will build the plan to fix that issue. If some of these things that that audit will identify aren't trivial to resolve, and you've got those the risk ratings and the time frames for remediation. So sometimes the best you can do in that time frame is that plan for a plan, but you need to be given time to fix it, and that collaboration between an audit team, a security team, or any part of the business for that matter, to really drill down into what is actually going to drive meaningful change. I think that's where the value comes. And the partnership is so important. If you've got a security leader who doesn't want to engage with audit, they are missing out, because you guys can help us do what we couldn't do to our organisation. So I think the partnership is so important.
Excellent, thank you both. Please join me in thanking Mick and Simon.